Today, we're going to tell you a story that might make you terrified of even visiting your own farm. Farms that secretly nurtures spirits within themselves. Hecakira Farm, nestled in the heart of dense forests, was a place where time seemed to stand still. The farm, with its cracked stone walls and an old roof sagging under the weight of winter snow, painted a picture of isolation and silence. Ancient oak trees surrounded the farm, their intertwined branches creating an oppressive atmosphere. When the wind passed through these branches, it made a sound like indistinct murmurs, as if emerging from the depths of the forest. The small wooden house, home to the Gerbier family, resembled more a refuge from a forgotten past. Inside, an old fireplace with a dim flame was the only source of warmth in the bone-chilling winter cold. Every corner of this house was filled with strange and eerie shadows that seemed to move in the flickering light of the candles. Andreas Grobier, the head of the family, was a tall and bony man with a perpetually stern and serious expression. His rough, cracked hands bore the marks of years of back-breaking labor on the unforgiving farmland. He was a man of few words, and when he spoke, his tone was cold and commanding. To him, life was nothing but constant toil and survival. Kizelia, his wife, was a frail and pale woman whose face showed signs of exhaustion and despair. Her every move hinted at a deep-seated fear, as if she was always bracing for Andreas' reprimand or criticism. She spent most of her time in the small kitchen, baking simple, dry bread and taking care of her children and grandchildren. Victoria, the family's daughter, had returned to her parental home after the death of her husband. She was a middle-aged woman with a face full of sorrow. Her eyes always held a weary look, but she tried to maintain her spirits for the sake of her two young children, 7-year-old Kizelia and 2-year-old Joseph. Kizelia was a curious and talkative child who often asked questions that simple answers couldn't satisfy. Meanwhile, Joseph, with his innocent laughter, was the only sign of joy in this weary life. Life on Hecakira Farm was never easy. The long, unending winters with heavy snow turned the surrounding land into a motionless sea of white. In this isolation, the howl of the wind or the cracking of a dry branch was the only sound breaking the silence. The people in nearby villages believed the farm was cursed. There were old rumors passed down through generations. Some said that years ago, a stranger had died on the farm, and his spirit still wandered the area. Others believed the surrounding forest was haunted and home to mysterious, unknown creatures. A few weeks before that fateful night, small incidents occurred on the farm, but no one paid much attention to them. One day, Andreas noticed that one of his farming tools had disappeared. He assumed he had left it somewhere else or simply forgotten about it. A few days later, little Kizelia told her mother that at night, while trying to sleep, she had heard whispers coming from outside the house. Victoria dismissed it with a nervous laugh and said, "It's just the wind rustling through the trees." But deep down, she felt something strange. The family dog, usually a reliable guard, now spent most of its time in a corner of the barn. trembling oddly every time a sound came from the forest. The cold winter nights on Hecakira Farm were always heavy with an oppressive silence, as if even the wind held its breath. But on that February night, the stillness was broken by the sound of a knock on the front door. The knock was not only loud and abrupt, but carried something in it that sent a chill down Andreas's spine. He got up from his bed anxiously, lit the lantern, and glanced at Kezzelia, who was sleeping beside him. She, too, had woken up with a worried expression, but neither of them said a word. Andreas quietly picked up the lantern and headed toward the door. The echo of the heavy knocks rang in his ears, as if someone was insistently demanding to be let in. When he opened the door, he saw nothing but darkness and snow glistening faintly under the dim lantern light. What unsettled him the most, however, was the unusual silence that engulfed the surroundings. Not even the wind or the creaking of trees could be heard. He stepped outside and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The next morning, as always, Andreas went to the barn to work. The ground was still covered in snow, and the cold seeped into his bones. As he approached the barn door, something caught his attention: fresh footprints in the snow leading toward the barn. The footprints were eerily distinct, as though someone wearing heavy boots had walked across the snow. But the strangest thing was that the tracks started deep within the forest and led only to the barn door. There was no sign of a return path. Andreas initially told himself, maybe someone passed through the forest and hid somewhere, but he couldn't shake the unease in his heart. He opened the barn door and carefully looked inside. Everything was in its place. Nothing was missing, yet a heavy and strange atmosphere filled the barn. When Andreas mentioned the footprints to Kezzelia, her worry deepened. Maybe we should tell the neighbors or notify the police. But Andreas replied coldly, it's just a drifter lost in the snow. No one needs to know. This wasn't the first time something unusual had happened on the farm. Just last week, faint whispers had been heard coming from the forest, a sound so elusive it was impossible to pinpoint its source. The family's dog, who usually barked at any disturbance, now simply trembled and sought refuge in a corner of the barn. A few nights later, as the Gruber family gathered around the table for dinner, a strange rustling noise came from behind the house. Little Kezzelia, sitting beside her mother, perked up her ears and said, "Someone's out there." Andreas nervously got up and lit the lantern. He went to the back door of the house and opened it. A cold wind blew in, making the lantern's flame flicker. Everything behind the house seemed normal, but when he looked down at the ground, he saw footprints again. This time, the footprints started near Kezzelia's window and led toward the forest. He didn't say anything this time, but his mind was filled with unanswered questions. Why would someone be wandering around the house like this? And why was there no sign of them returning? That night, everyone went to sleep with a heavy feeling. In the middle of the night, little Kezzelia screamed and woke up. Victoria, who was in the next room, rushed to her. Kezzelia, with terrified eyes, said, "A man in black was standing by my bed. He was just standing there, staring at me. Victoria turned on the light, but saw nothing. The window was open, and the curtains were swaying in the wind. She hugged Cazelia and said it was just a nightmare, but deep down, she knew that something more than a dream was happening in the house. The next morning, when Victoria mentioned it to Andreas, he just shook his head and said, "It's just a child's imagination. We have no reason to be afraid of such things." But the truth was, Andreas no longer felt at peace. He would wake up at the slightest sound during the night, lantern in hand, walking around the house. Something invisible, something unknown had entered the farm. The shadows of the forest, which had once been a natural backdrop to their lives, now seemed to turn into a threatening observer, and everyone knew that this was just the beginning of the story. This event was only the start. Something unknown, something beyond human understanding, had stepped onto the Hecakira Farm, and no one could predict what the outcome of this presence would be. The nights at Hecakira Farm remained long and endless, and with each passing night, the absolute silence seemed to grow heavier. Within this silence, strange events occurred that no one could explain. One night, when everyone was asleep, the sound of the wind howling through the trees suddenly stopped. Then another strange sound was heard, a whisper that seemed to come from inside the barn. Victoria, who had woken up, looked out the window of her room. The barn's lantern had unexpectedly lit up and after a few minutes went out again. This happened several times without any explanation. Andreas had become increasingly sensitive to every small sound at night. With the lantern in hand, he would patrol around the house, searching for any signs of unknown creatures that seemed to be hiding in the darkness. But every time he passed through the forest or around the house, he saw nothing but silence and shadows. The family dog, who had always been a loyal guardian, could no longer sleep peacefully at night. Every night it would crawl into a corner of the barn, its large, fearful eyes fixed on the door and walls. Every time a sound, like footsteps from a distance, was heard, the dog would bark. But the noise would quickly turn into a deadly silence. Andreas, who considered himself a man of reason, and disbelief in superstitions, tried to reassure himself and his family. But with every strange sound, his heart grew more unsettled. A few days later, Victoria noticed something odd. One of Joseph's pants, which had recently been washed, had disappeared. At first, she thought perhaps Joseph had taken it somewhere, but after searching the house, there was no sign of it. Anxious and uneasy, she searched everywhere again, and this time she went behind the barn. There, among the freshly fallen snow, she found Joseph's pants. But what worried her the most was the condition of the pants. They were completely dry and clean, as if they had been kept somewhere for days and had then mysteriously appeared here. Victoria, trembling with fear, said to her mother, "Someone might be hiding around the house. These pants, there's no way they could have just reappeared here on their own." Cazelia, who usually tried to brush aside her daughter's worries, couldn't ignore it this time. With a nervous smile, she said, "It's just an accident, my dear. Maybe Joseph lost his pants and they just happened to end up here." But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a simple accident. She felt that something was changing, something happening in the shadows of darkness that couldn't be ignored so easily. Nights grew longer than ever before. A sense of fear and anxiety among the Grobier family grew stronger with its passing day. Victoria could no longer deceive herself. Something was moving around the house, an invisible presence that wandered at night near their home. One night, as Andreas walked around the house once more, he heard slow footsteps from behind him. He immediately turned around, but there was no one there. The trees appeared motionless, but in the heart of the darkness, he felt something moving within the shadows. The feeling was so strong and real that for a moment, he wondered if perhaps there was something beyond what he could comprehend, something truly present in this place. Several weeks after these strange occurrences, one night while Victoria was sitting in her room, she suddenly heard a rustling sound. Terrified, she sprang to her feet and ran toward the door, but before she could reach it, the door to her room slammed shut. With a pounding heart, she stood still in the room, staring into the darkness. She felt that something was there, something she couldn't see, but could feel its presence. Then, a soft sound came from the corner of the room, the sound of footsteps drawing closer. Victoria suddenly screamed and ran to her mother's room. When Cazelia woke up and turned on the light, there was nothing in the room, yet in the hearts of both mother and daughter, a deeper sense of fear had taken root. The next morning, Andreas went back to the barn, but this time he looked around more carefully. Nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him. When he opened the barn door, something was waiting for him inside. The foul smell that reached his nose made him cover his mouth with his hand. Each light is like lighting a candle in the darkness of this story. Help bring in more light. Something had changed in the barn. All the farming tools were scattered, and it seemed that someone or something had entered and used them. This was another sign of an unnatural presence on the farm. Andreas could no longer remain silent about these events. He needed to understand the truth. But what was waiting for him? And could he and his family escape this ever-expanding darkness? The nights gradually turned into a hell from which none of the Grobier family members could escape. The nightmares that turned each of their nights into a terrifying experience cast shadows everywhere. Victoria dreamed she was walking through a dark, damp forest. The black intertwined trees were pressed tightly about her head, and shadows moved in every corner. Faint cries could be heard. Her child's, Cazelia's. Victoria ran to follow the cries, but every time she got closer, a dark, opaque shadow would rush at her, taking the child from her arms. She screamed, but the cries only grew louder, and she could never reach her destination. The shadows around her grew more and more, dancing and coming toward her. Each time she tried to escape them in her sleep, more shadows emerged from the trees, stretching their icy hands toward her. Victoria's scream echoed in her sleep, and she would wake up in terror, gasping for breath, tears welling up in her eyes. Andreas also had nightmares that robbed him of his peace. He dreamed that he was lost deep in the forest. Trees had grown wildly around him, and darkness quickly enveloped him. The sound of the wind or perhaps something approaching him in the dead of night reached his ears. He moved, but his steps seemed to disappear oddly. He felt something moving behind him, something he could never see. Strange, deep breathing sounds came from the trees and rocks, and he couldn't tell what they belonged to. The more he ran, the more the disturbing sounds grew louder behind him. Even sounds that seemed to resemble laughter followed him. "Don't follow me!" he shouted, but nothing could take this nightmare away from him. Kezelia, the youngest daughter of the family, was the most frightened by her nightmares. She could never sleep at night. In her dreams, a black man like a shadow that had consumed everything around her would enter her room. One night, in the midst of a deep sleep, Kezelia suddenly woke up with a loud scream. Her eyes wildly darted around, and then she cried out, "There was a man beside my bed! He was black like a shadow!" Victoria, who had quickly rushed to her daughter's room, found only a faint shadow in the room. No one was there. There was no sign of the black man, but Kezelia still trembled in her bed, staring fearfully at every corner of the room. One cold night in March, the snow that had settled on the ground began to harden, and the cold intensified night by night. During these bitterly cold nights, an endless sense of terror weighed heavily on the hearts of the Grover family members. The sound of heavy footsteps tapping on the roof of the house continued to echo. A noise that emerged from the darkness of the night mysteriously grew closer to the house. It felt as though something was moving about the house, something you couldn't see but could feel its presence. Andreas, tired and frustrated by these events, grabbed his rifle and lantern in hand, headed towards the barn. His heart was heavy, but inside him, the flames of anger and fear were burning brighter. He intended to rid the dark and dangerous places of these mysterious creatures. Step by step, he moved toward the barn, every ticking of the clock sounding like footsteps following him. Although he tried to appear strong, he couldn't escape the feeling deep inside him. When Andreas reached the barn, what awaited him was not what he had anticipated. A dark, tall, faceless shadow stood in the corner of the barn. Its red eyes shone like two flames in the night. Andreas was frozen, unable to move. The faceless creature, almost invisible in the darkness, drew him in, its presence suffocating. The shadow remained still, as if measuring the extent of the terror Andreas was feeling. Andreas began to retreat in fear, but the shadow quickly moved closer. Just as he was about to return to the house, the shadow suddenly disappeared into the darkness. Andreas rushed back to the house and slammed the door shut, but his heart was still unsettled. Something deep inside told him this was not the end, but the beginning of an onslaught from something they could no longer escape. He never could bring himself to tell his family the truth. The shadow that had stared at him remained imprinted in his mind. In the dead of night, every small sound and movement became a new nightmare for him, but he could never explain what had happened to him in that moment. The cold and dark nights continued, and as everyone drowned in silence and fear in the heart of winter, the Grover family struggled every night in a house filled with dread to maintain their composure. The house, deep in the forest and stripped of any natural life, had turned into a cold, lifeless graveyard in the middle of the night. A few nights after the terrifying events of the previous nights, the Grover family gathered around the fireplace. The fire danced in the wood, but in the hearts of each family member, flames of anxiety and fear had been ignited. The howling wind could be heard from outside, and the windows of the house occasionally rattled violently. Victoria gently sang a lullaby for Joseph. Her soft and soothing voice could be heard amid the frightening atmosphere. Every time the wind blew louder, Victoria's eyes would shift toward the ceiling, as though something up there was watching her. Kezelia, who was quietly knitting her little clothes, sat beside Victoria. But her eyes were filled with worry. It seemed that at any moment, a shadow might be lurking in the corner of the house. Andreas, a man who had nothing left but fear and anxiety, stared motionlessly at the flames. His face had the color of the ashes, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. Something deep inside him told him that this night could be the last of his life, but none of the family members could sense this fear. Suddenly, a heavy banging sound was heard from outside. The howling wind, which had momentarily ceased, was replaced by the sound of repeated knocks coming from the barn. These sounds, in the heart of the night, seemed like the cries of the unknown, suggesting the presence of something foreign in the house.
What is this shadow, and where will these scary events lead? And what will happen to the Grobier family? Stay with us until the end of the video.
Andreas, trembling from the sounds, quickly stood up and grabbed his rifle. His hands were shaking violently, as if something in the darkness was waiting for him at every moment. Victoria, deeply worried, ran after him and begged him to be careful. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the house, but something in her heart warned her that they would not survive this night. With trembling hands, Andreas, holding a lantern, made his way toward the barn. In the stillness of the night, the sound of his footsteps was heard, but nothing could stop him from continuing down this path. The next morning, as dawn cast shadows over the forest and sunlight barely filtered through the trees, the neighbors went to the Grobier house. Nobody knew anything about that night, except that the heavy banging from the barn had stopped and nothing else could be heard from the Grobier family. A few neighbors, who all instinctively felt they should check in, decided to go to the house. When they reached the barn, a horrifying and heartbreaking scene unfolded before them. The bodies of Andreas, Kezelia, Victoria, and 2 children were scattered in the barn. Each had been brutally killed with an axe. But what was even more terrifying was the condition of little Kezelia's body. It appeared that she had been alive for hours after the other family members were killed. Signs of injuries and bleeding from prolonged struggle were visible on her body. Her hands were severely wounded and clawed, as if she had fought desperately to survive against her murderers. Around the bodies, blood was splattered on the ground, and pieces of wood were scattered from the axe blows. Inside the house, horrific evidence was found indicating that the killer had stayed in the house for several days after the murders and had lived there. Food from the kitchen had been eaten, with meat, bread, and even milk in the refrigerator significantly reduced. The pets in the yard had been strangely fed, as if the killer had also fed them to prepare for their horrific act. Even the beds were made, as if someone had been living in the house, and there were apparently no signs of an attempt to escape or fear from this person. In fact, the house appeared strangely tidy and clean, even after such brutal murders had taken place. When the neighbors and local authorities arrived at the scene, there was no sign of the killer. The trees of the forest, still swaying violently in the wind, seemed to silently witness the horrific crimes. Was the killer still hiding in the woods? Had he returned to the house to continue a story even more horrifying than what they had seen? No one knew But what was certain was that the fear and terror that had shadowed the Grobier family had now spread over the entire village and the ancient trees of the forest. As time passed, it could not restore peace to the Hecakira Farm. Years after the tragedy that had devastated the Grobier family, the house still stood in the heart of the forest, looking abandoned and eerie. Its decaying wooden walls, broken windows, and a roof that trembled against the cold night winds bore witness to the horrific moments of the past. The villagers living near the farm had never forgotten what had happened to the Grobier family. They avoided getting close to the place out of fear and horror. Some even swore that at night, when they looked up at the sky in the darkness, they heard footsteps coming from within the house. Steps that no one knew where they came from, but always echoed in the heart of the night at the very moment the wind blew. Eyewitnesses sometimes passed by the house and saw a dark, faceless shadow moving through the broken, dark windows. A shadow that could not belong to any human or animal. And today, if anyone dared to approach the Hecakira Farm at night, the fear would grip their heart, a fear that grew heavier with each step. In the silent, foggy nights, those who ventured near the farm might hear faint whispers carried by the wind. Whispers that drifted through the old, decaying trees, reaching their ears. "Turn back, you are cursed." These voices did not come from any human, but from a dark and deep place within the forest. It seemed as if they were part of the curses that remained in that house. A curse that had taken root deep in the earth and would continue forever. One night, a group of researchers and brave individuals decided to enter the farm to uncover the truth. They arrived at Hecakira Farm at night and carefully began to examine the area. Hours passed, but nothing seemed normal in the darkness. They anxiously looked around until one of them screamed in terror. Near the barn, where the bodies of the Grobier family had been found, something unusual was seen in the heart of the night. The sound of doors opening and closing without any breeze came from inside the barn. The flash of their cameras cast a weak light inside, but what they saw resembled dead hands emerging from the cracks in the door, hands that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth. Anyone who approached this farm felt the same sensation, a fear that takes root in the hearts of people, halting them in their tracks. It was as if everything that had happened at the Hecakira Farm still lingered in the air. Cold breeze emerging from the depths of the forest seemed to carry messages for those brave enough to enter this place. "Turn back, you are cursed." These voices faded in the wind, but for anyone who heard them, peace was elusive. The death at Hecakira Farm was merely the beginning of an endless curse that persisted with each generation. Anyone seeking the truth became a part of this curse themselves. And the Hecakira Farm, with its horrific and cursed story, stood firm in the heart of the forest, a house that no one dared enter, a house forever shrouded in darkness and fear, where the ghosts of the past awaited. That night, a shadow lurked in the forest more than ever. Maybe one of you has had this scary experience. Please write us your thoughts in the comments.